then Ron decided to start his own fanzine, in which he began reviewing all of these bands and recordings he was getting, sharing with his readers all the new discoveries he was making. Ron would call his fanzine Metal Mania, a name he selected over another idea he had, Metallica. Quintana, though, liked Metal Mania better. Plus, this weird European kid he had met at a record store in Berkeley had liked the name Metallica and asked if he could use it for his band, that Ron wasn't sure whether it existed or not. Ron had first been drawn to this Lars Ulrich kid because he had been wearing this jacket covered in buttons and patches of various underground European bands that most Americans had never heard of. In particular, Ron and the friend he was with at the time took notice of patches for bands like Silverwing and Demon Pact, groups they'd only ever heard about. Hoping to learn more, Ron and his friend then approached Lars and started asking him about these groups. Lars was apparently more than happy to share what he knew, as he was excited to share his love of heavy metal with other like-minded individuals, as again it was apparently pretty rare in those days to find others who were also into heavy metal. It also wasn't just a fans who struggled in the musical climate in America at that time. New York's Twisted Sister, for example, would have to go to England and find fame there, because the scene was so dead back at home. This fact would actually confuse some people when they returned to the States after making a name for themselves in England, as those individuals fully expected the band to have British accents. Over in LA, meanwhile, at the start of the decade, Van Halen was the only band playing a harder style of rock that was having any kind of success. The band that had originally been named Rat Salad after an instrumental on Black Sabbath's Paranoid album was finding success in part due to Eddie Van Halen, who brought a new level of technical prowess to guitar playing. His showy solos put a spotlight on himself and on the band as a whole, while they glamorized the wild Hollywood lifestyle in their music. Yet, even though Van Halen seemed to be the only hard rock band having any success as the 80s began, there were a slew of bands just waiting in the wings. These bands were combining the sounds of the new wave of British heavy metal with the feel-good Hollywood party attitude of Van Halen, while also taking some cues from glam rock bands like the New York Dolls. Bands like Rat and Motley Crue, two groups who really spearheaded the metal scene in LA, reportedly actually started out fairly heavy. Rat was in fact heavily influenced by Judas Priest, with Brian Slagel, the eventual founder of Metal Blade Records, calling early Rat, quote, basically Judas Priest. They would all wear black and they had two guys playing flying V guitars. Motley Crue, meanwhile, took their cues from punk and from shock rockers like Alice Cooper and Kiss, as they incorporated fake blood, smoke, and pyrotechnics in their stage shows. In fact, Motley Crue was heavy enough in their early days to catch the attention of one young metalhead, James Hetfield, who we will be talking about more later. Meanwhile, another LA band, Wasp, also focused on theatrics and elaborate stage shows by utilizing torture instruments, skulls on poles, fog machines, pyro, and exploding codpieces, because why not, I guess. Now, I will say I did go online and give a listen to the early output of these bands, and you can definitely hear the Nawabum influence in all of them. Yet, added to that classic Nawabum sound are the sing-along choruses, good time lyrics, and slick-sounding production that wasn't as present in the British bands. That being said, I would argue that in general, these bands are heavier at this point than the true Nawabum band that came over and joined this movement, Def Leppard. I would also like to make a quick addendum here. If you like these bands, that's great. Like what you like. I'm not here to tell you what to like or suggest there's something wrong with you for liking it. If you're getting enjoyment out of it, great. As long as you're not hurting anyone else, that's all that matters. It's the same thing with the console wars or with wrestling. I don't own an Xbox or watch WWE, but if you do, what does it matter to me? And by that same token, what does it matter to anyone else that I own a PlayStation and watch AEW? I've never understood people who get all up in arms because someone enjoys a different entertainment product than they do. If you like glam/hair metal, great, I don't want to take that away from you. I just want to give you a fair warning, I personally don't care for it. Even after giving a listen to a bunch of their singles as research, I still am not a fan. It's just not my thing, but it was for a lot of people. So if you're one of them, great, no judgments here. Just a warning, even though I try to be fair, there will probably be a bit of a negative slant towards these bands. Back on topic, these bands were essentially taking some of what the new wave of British heavy metal groups were doing and adding a bit of a Hollywood splash to it, while making basically everything about themselves over the top. LA then became a natural stomping ground for such acts, as in addition to being the home of a number of major record companies, the city also featured clubs like the Whiskey A Go Go, the Starwood, the Troubadour, the Roxy Theater, and the Cat House. These clubs, the majority at least being located on the Sunset Strip, became for glam metal what the Soundhouse had been for the Nawabum bands, meaning it was here where these bands first played and started becoming popular. Every Wednesday night, it seems, bands like Motley Crue and Riot would play in these clubs for $1 cover charge. It was here on the Sunset Strip in these clubs then that the early glam metal scene first coalesced. Now, despite their larger-than-life image, these first wave of glam/hair metal bands seem to have at the very least lived hard lives, as they dedicated everything to their dreams of making it big. They lived in cramped, squalid conditions, living hand-to-mouth, all in the hopes of getting noticed. So, while I may not be a fan of their music or their whole scene in general, I do at the very least respect the dedication. Also, to their credit, their guitarists weren't slouches. The lead guitarists in these bands were very inspired by Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads, who had originally been a part of Quiet Riot before joining Ozzy Osbourne, who himself had gone solo after leaving Black Sabbath. Van Halen and Rhoads then had really pioneered a faster and even flashier way of playing that really fit in with the over-the-top image these bands were going for. Everything about them, from their lyrics, the way they played, to their looks and their stage shows, was all over the top and all about excess. All of this was building for some time, until 1982 the proverbial floodgates opened in LA, as Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love and Rats You Think You're Tough caught the attention of record company execs when they started getting airtime on local LA radio stations. Soon, both bands would be signed to major label deals, and they wouldn't be alone, as Quiet Riot and Dokken would join them as well. Yet just getting a record deal did not guarantee these bands fame and fortune. To really hit it big, these bands needed to reach a wider audience, but most radio stations in the US weren't looking to play bands that were labeled as heavy metal yet. A real tipping point in demonstrating the popularity of heavy metal in the US would then take place in May 1983, when Steve Wozniak funded a 3-day outdoor music festival at the Glen Helen Regional Park in San Bernardino, California over the Memorial Day weekend. Calling it the US Festival, this was the second such event the tech millionaire had funded. Each of the days of this event were themed, with the first and third days, Saturday and Monday, being new wave and rock respectively. These days consisted of lineups featuring a who's who of radio-friendly popular bands like INXS, The Clash, The Flock of Seagulls, Men at Work, U2, Joe Walsh, and David Bowie. Although there was a hang-up with The Clash, who threatened not to perform when the event's promoters reportedly reneged on an agreement to donate 10% of the gross to poor people in the area. When this happened, The Clash and their management held a press conference in which they announced they were refusing to go on unless the promoters agreed to donate $100,000 to charity, eventually getting them to agree to donate $40,000. With that being said, for our purposes, it's notable that both the New Wave and Rock Days each drew a sizable crowd of 300,000 people to see the event live and in person, despite the reportedly sweltering conditions. Even more notable, though, was the fact that sandwiched in between those 2 days was Sunday, a day dedicated to heavy metal that featured a lineup consisting of Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, Ozzy Osbourne, Judas Priest, The Scorpions, and Van Halen, a lineup that drew a crowd of 600,000 people, double what the other 2 days had done. The US Festival then showed that heavy metal was at least on par with the generally accepted radio-friendly acts of the day with being a live draw. Yet, despite this, radio stations still seemed hesitant to put such acts on their airwaves, which is what makes the 2-hour US Festival special so important. This special, which consisted of highlights from the event, aired repeatedly throughout the summer on Showtime, garnering a sizable audience every time it did. The popularity of this special, which included performances from the aforementioned heavy metal bands, then caught the attention of programmers on other cable stations. USA Network, for example, had a pair of shows, Night Flight and Radio 1990, that aired music videos. Shows that, in the wake of the US Festival, started airing more clips from these clearly popular heavy metal groups. Which is where MTV came in. Now, apparently, the station's initial music video offering strongly resembled what was popular on the radio. Which makes sense, but to set themselves apart from the radio and any potential competitors, the network needed something different, something flashier, something more attention-getting. In these LA-based heavy metal bands, MTV then found the perfect partners. They were new, they were clearly popular, and their over-the-top presentation from their outfits to their stage shows was exactly what they were looking for. Their music was all about excess and extravagance, and so was everything about them. TV then would be a perfect showcase for these bands and their over-the-top image. Oddly enough, though, the first metal band to take advantage of this opportunity was not actually from LA. Def Leppard had been a part of the new wave of British heavy metal, but had since moved towards a sound that catered more towards mainstream audiences. The Def Leppard that would be heard on MTV played an upbeat style of metal that had harmonized vocals, good time lyrics, and was not as fast or aggressive as some of the other Nawabum bands. Yet, despite taking advantage of this new medium, Def Leppard simply could not knock off the juggernaut that was Michael Jackson's Thriller from the top of the Billboard charts. The band that would finally put a stop to Thriller's unprecedented 37-week run at the top of the charts, though, would be one of the upstart LA glam metal bands, as in November 1983, Quiet Riot's Mental Health became the first metal album to reach the vaulted top spot on the Billboard album chart. That same year, Motley Crue would also release their breakthrough album, Shout at the Devil, while Rat released their first EP in '83, followed by their first full-length album Out of the Cellar in '84. Both bands would also capitalize on the exposure from the new phenomenon of music videos, as thanks to MTV, their album sales doubled and even tripled. Also, taking advantage of this situation were Twisted Sister, whose Stay Hungry album went double platinum, in no small part due to the videos We're Not Going to Take It and I Wanna Rock. The thing was, as we will see, once these metal bands got on MTV, they never got heavier. Instead, they all went in the opposite direction, which is notable as they all seem to do it. If only some of the bands went in this direction, it would be fair to chalk it up to their own artistic choice to do so. Soon enough then, these groups who had started out emulating British heavy metal with a bit of a Hollywood flair were better known for playing ballads. Meanwhile, as these LA groups are turning their attention to MTV and music videos, there were another group of young American heavy metal bands who focused more on growing their fame through touring. In contrast to the LA groups who were focused more and more on their image, these more rebellious bands were focused on things like who could play heavier and faster. So, we will for now leave the ranks of the MTV army and turn our attention towards a group of young upstarts who would take a much different path to notoriety. This part of our story starts with two young metal fans named James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich. Yet, for as much of an impact as these two men would have on the world of heavy metal and music in general, they really did not have a lot in common. James, you see, came from a strict Christian Science middle-class family who lived in Downey, an industrial suburb of Los Angeles. The Hetfields were so devout that James wasn't even allowed to take health class in high school because his parents feared he learned too much about his body. In fact, his mother, a former opera singer, would even refuse medical care after being diagnosed with cancer, a choice that led to her death in 1979, something which clearly had an impact on young James, who would compare his home life to being raised in a pressure cooker. It was as a result of this environment that he would become something of a loner, and it was likely why he committed a number of petty thefts before ultimately turning his attention to playing guitar. Now, Lars, on the other hand, had a much different childhood experience. In fact, he didn't even live in America in his youth, as his family lived in Copenhagen. Not only that, but the Ulrich family was fairly well off thanks to his father's pro tennis career. His parents were also reportedly quite liberal in their child-rearing ways, in stark contrast to the repressive atmosphere of the Hetfield household. Growing up, Lars seemed intent on following in his father's footsteps. Indeed, he was even a ranked tennis player in Denmark. However, when the family moved to California, Lars found that he could not compete with the larger, more athletic jocks he found there. So he turned his focus away from tennis toward his other passion, heavy metal, and the heavier the better in Lars's opinion. Indeed, once he shifted his focus, Lars was all in. He was fully dedicated to this new obsession. And just to give you an idea of the kind of wealth and environment he grew up in, Lars thought nothing of flying to England to get a chance to see one of his favorite bands, Diamond Head, playing live. You see, Lars had grown up frequently taking trips with his family for his father's tennis matches. It was such a usual practice that after a certain age, his parents didn't think much of him traveling back and forth to Europe on his own. Now, Diamond Head were one of the lesser-known Nawabum bands. Yet, when he purchased a copy of their first album, Lightning to the Nation, through Sounds magazine, Lars fell in love. So he flew to London from California just to see them play. More than that, though, he even got the opportunity to meet the band, who were surprised to learn that he had traveled so far just to see them. In fact, upon learning that he had flown there from California, they asked if he had someplace to stay while he was in England. Lars admitted that he had not actually arranged anything yet, at which point guitarist Brian Tatler invited him to come and stay with his family. Lars then slept on the floor of Brian's bedroom for a week before staying with singer Sean Harris for 4 weeks. This was a formative experience for Lars, as afterwards he seriously started looking to put his own band together. To that end, he put an ad out announcing that he was a metal drummer looking for other musicians, not really worrying about the fact that he really didn't know how to play the drums yet. It was through this ad then that Lars first met James Hetfield. Now, James himself didn't actually